Hi, my name is Alex Zaharakis. I'm here today with Dr. James Adams. We have the talk today on fungal infections with respect to autism spectrum disorder. I'm going to give a brief introduction of Dr. Adams. He's a director of the Autism and Asperger Research Program at Arizona State University, working in conjunction with physicians, nutritionists, biochemists, and others. His research is focused on the causes and treatment of autism across the lifespan. Dr. Adams believes the addition of research-based biomedical therapy to treat individuals with autism spectrum disorder can improve the effectiveness of ongoing educational, therapeutic, and behavioral interventions. Dr. Adams has a PhD in materials engineering, but for the last 20 years has focused his research on the biological causes of autism and how to treat it. He's published over 200 peer-reviewed scientific articles, including over 50 on autism. He has led many clinical trials, including nutritional supplementation, microbiota transplant, and detoxification. In this live chat today, Dr. Adams will provide some general recommendations for the detection and treatment of intestinal yeast overgrowth in people with autism. Dr. Adams, thanks so much for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks very much, Alex. So I want to give a talk that I've only given once before, so parts of it may be a little rough. I may digress here and there, but my thinking about yeast has changed a lot since we first studied it 10 years ago, and I think we underestimated then how important it was. And so I want to share with you this information, and you can also get more information in general about our research from our website. I'll start off with an anecdote, though, just to give you some sense of how powerful these yeast infections can be. With my father, who was a bright man when he was younger, Harvard graduate, vice president of a bank, he retired, and in his older years, he began having a little bit of dementia. And then I had a call from his wife saying that he had been wandering around the neighborhood in his pajamas at night, trying to encourage people to seek Jesus. And this is just totally unlike him. He was just very irrational. It was very puzzling. And so I flew down. She just said she couldn't take him anymore. So I brought him to Arizona to live with us. And so I was suspicious of a couple things. We had them checked out. And one of the issues he had was a urinary tract infection. And the initial one he had was a bacterial infection. This is very common in men because of their prostate enlarging as they become older. They're not able to fully empty their bladder. And so if they can't empty their bladder, then they're very prone to yeast infections, urinary tract infections. And so every time he had his behavior dramatically worsened, we went and checked for a UTI, and sure enough, every time he had a major worsening of his behavior, we would treat it. And the last time, it was not a bacterial infection, and so it took us longer to track it down, but it was a yeast infection. So it was very clear that in his case, and many elderly people, it's very common for urinary tract infections to cause substantial dementia. So I spoke about it with the people at his nursing home, and they observed this. It's very, very common in the elderly. So I'll just give that little backdrop in mind that a bacterial or a yeast infection in elderly people can cause significant, it was quite dramatic dementia and dramatic clearing after it's treated. So just to give you a little bit of personal background, as Alex said, I direct an autism research program at ASU. I'm also the president of a nonprofit that I founded, the Autism Nutrition Research Center. They produce a vitamin mineral supplement based on our research. I've been the president of the Autism Society of Greater Phoenix for 22 years. I'm also the president of a new company, Autism Diagnostics. We're developing metabolic-based tests for detecting autism, diagnosing autism, and evaluating what's metabolically wrong. We hope that will become commercially available soon. I work with the Autism Research Institute, the oldest autism group in the world, founded by Bernie Rimland. I'm proud to be the co-leader of their science advisory committee. Also, I co-founded the Neurological Health Foundation, whose mission is to prevent neurological disorders in children. And so we've developed a prenatal supplement that should be coming out in the market this month, the first prenatal tailored for each trimester. I'm a consultant for Finch Therapeutics, which is working with us on developing microbiota transplant therapy for autism. And all of this is driven because I'm a father of a daughter with autism. I've done a lot of different types of autism research, doing research in vitamins and minerals, fatty acids, amino acids, ribose, on metabolism, looking at how nutrition affects metabolism, mitochondrial functioning, toxic metals, GI issues, including gut bacteria. And the focus of today's talk is on yeast. And we're also doing a study on probiotics that I'll mention at the end of the talk. We've done a little bit of work looking at immunology. They've written a few review articles on seizures and wrote an article on advice for helping people with autism find and keep a job. So I work in a lot of different areas. I won't claim to be an expert in any one, but I do want to share with you what we've been researching and discovered, both from our own research and reading other people's research on yeast and fungal infections. So just in general, yeast is a type of fungi that's normally present in the mucosa of humans, especially in the GI tract. A normal immune system and competing bacteria prevent it from overgrowing. So everyone usually has some amount of yeast in their gut. But the question is, do you have an excessive amount? Has it developed an overgrowth? So one of the common overgrowths is called thrush. That's an oral candida infection. Candida is a genus of yeast, and it is very common in infants because their microbiome is immature and their immune system is immature. But also it can occur in people who are immunocompromised. So people with AIDS, candida infections can be very nasty and life-threatening. One of the reasons that yeast infections can occur is increased antibiotic usage. At one time, when you prescribed antibiotics, it was fairly common to follow that with an antifungal, but that's no longer the practice today. But we've published several articles, and other groups have as well, reporting increased use of antibiotics in children with autism, and that's a risk factor for yeast infection. So I think a take-home message is that if your child had a history of excessive antibiotic use, they're probably at increased risk of a yeast infection. Candida is the most common yeast infection in humans, especially Candida albicans, but there are other types as well. Let me share with you the four of the published research studies about how common intestinal yeast infections are in children with autism. So 10 years ago, I did a study with Doctors Data. They're a major testing lab, and we used their standard stool testing kit. And we had families collect stool samples. We collected samples from 58 children with autism and 39 control children, healthy children, who were not siblings. And we did many different measurements on them. We learned a great deal from them. But one thing that we observed is that 28% of children with autism had a positive yeast culture. Usually, most of the cases, it was Candida albicans, whereas only 13% of the typical children had them. That wasn't quite statistically significant, p of 0.13. So it was suggestive that there was a problem, but it wasn't enough to be statistically significant. So at the time, that puzzled us a bit. We left it at the research at that point and moved on to other areas. But I will come back to that in a moment. 3 other studies have found very similar results as well. There's a very large study done in Turkey. 415 children with autism or children who are suspected to have autism. 405 typical children. They found 35% of the autism group had Candida albicans versus only 11% of the control, so 3 times as common. They found also 7 other strains of yeast. And if you looked at all 7 of the strains, 81% of the children with autism had one or more strains of yeast in them versus only 20% of the healthy controls. So that's a big difference, and that's a much larger number than we were able to observe. There was another study in Italy with 40 children with autism and 40 typical children. They looked at the general genus of Candida, so the category of many types of Candida. They found it in 38% of kids with autism versus 14% of controls. And that difference is very statistically significant. And then there was another study by a group in Italy the same year, 47 children with autism, 33 typical children, using a different type of methodology, using a yeast culture method. They found 57% of the kids with autism had yeast versus 0% of the controls. Why was there such a big difference in this study? Because in this study, 70% of the children with autism also had GI symptoms. So if you had gut dysbiosis, then you are much more likely to have a yeast infection. And they also checked the controls much more carefully to see that none of the controls had any GI symptoms. See, the problem is that of order 30% of typical people in the US have significant GI issues, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic constipation, diarrhea, etc. I don't know the numbers offhand for children, it depends on how you count it. So they screened very carefully to check that these children did not have GI issues. And none of them were positive for yeast. So they found 70% of the autism group versus 0% of the control group had these GI symptoms. And that's why 57% of the autism group had positive yeast versus 0% of the controls. So bottom line is that all 4 of the studies generally agree that children with autism have a higher rate of yeast infection. Depends on how you measure it, depends on if you use culture methods or if you use DNA-based methods, but anywhere from 28 to 70% of children with autism have yeast versus 0 to 20% of the controls. So the question is it enough yeast to cause a problem? As I said, everyone usually has some amount of yeast. These methods, culture methods, are limited as to how much they can detect. They're a fairly crude way to measure. So there was also a very interesting study, which I need to research more to see. It needs replication because it's a very unusual study that was done. But in this study out of Bulgaria, they looked at 15 children with autism, and they extracted in a complex way from blood samples. They were able to measure culturable fungi in their blood. That's very unusual to be able to find cultures of fungi in the blood. And they found that in 14 of the 15 children with autism and in none of the child controls. And I think there were about 15 or so. They also found it in the mothers of children with autism, but not in the controls. Now, they used very unusual detection methods, so I think it's appropriate to say this needs validation in other studies before we confirm this, but it's certainly intriguing and worthy of following up. I've tried to contact the investigator by email, but without any response. But one of the key questions we want to know is there an effect of yeast on autism symptoms? So we did the only study which tried to assess that. So as I mentioned, in a 2011 study, we found in addition to measuring GI symptoms and yeast symptoms and levels of yeast, we also measured or assessed autism severity. We used a scale developed by the Autism Research Institute called the ATEC scale, one of the most widely used scales because it's available for free from ARI. And so it assesses 4 different areas. It assesses language, social interaction, sensory and cognitive function, and overall physical and behavioral issues. And we found that overall, if you were the 28% of kids who had a positive yeast culture versus the others who did not, then you had a higher autism severity score, 24% higher. That's very intriguing. It was almost statistically significant. But of the four categories, which categories were actually different? The language subscale. Language subscale, 81% worse in people with a positive yeast culture. And sensory and cognitive awareness, the scores were 33% worse, whereas the other categories were not necessarily worse. Now, we haven't published this data yet. I have too many papers to write, so I do need to get around to publishing it, but it's just a small analysis, extra analysis of the study that we did in 2011. So this suggests that yeast is strongly associated with certain autism symptoms, especially language and somewhat sensory and cognitive problems. We can't say for sure that it's causing those problems, but we can say it's present and associated with it. Interestingly, we did not see that the presence of a positive yeast was associated with worse GI symptoms. So there's no obvious physical clue that these children had a yeast infection. So unlike when my father had a urinary tract infection, he did not have any pain, but some people do with a urinary tract infection, but not necessarily. But in children with autism, there doesn't seem to be any increase in physical pain or GI symptoms. Rather, it seems to primarily be affecting mental function. And that's very interesting. I want to talk more about that. But also, I want to explain something else that we did report in our 2011 paper, that secretory IgA is the main antibody in the GI tract. It's the main defense of the immune system against yeast and many other types of infections. And one thing we observed is that children with autism had a positive yeast culture, had a much lower level of secretory IgA compared to the children with autism who did not have negative yeast cultures. Wasn't quite statistically significant, but it was close. But also, the secretory IgAs were also 63% lower in the few typical children, the 5 typical children in our study, who had positive yeast cultures. And that was statistically significant. So we do know that there are 38 species of Candida which secrete proteases that specifically target and destroy secretory IgA. In other words, Candida has developed a defense mechanism against the body's defense mechanism. So by secreting these proteases, it destroys secretory IgA, which otherwise would harm the yeast. So my interpretation of this data is we don't know, chicken or egg, which came first. Is it because the children were lower in secretory IgA that the yeast could occur? Or is it because they developed a yeast infection and the yeast then began destroying secretory IgA and dropped it lower? I think it's probably some of both. But the bottom line is once a yeast infection occurs, it can become chronic by the yeast continuing to excrete secretory IgA and keeping by excreting proteases and thereby keeping secretory IgA levels low. So once you get an yeast infection, it appears it can last we suspect this could make it last a very long time. So let's talk a little bit more about yeast and how they form. It's very, very complicated. So let's start with this figure B. So yeast can attach to your gut, the lining of your gut, as single cells, and they can start to collect together. So each circle could be a single Candida albicans cell, for example. Then, if you see these blue squiggly lines, this is an extracellular matrix that they can begin. The orange part around it is the extracellular matrix they can begin excreting. This is basically what we call a biofilm. So the yeast, to protect themselves, excrete this polysaccharide biofilm that protects them greatly from any antifungals that are being applied. And so over time, this yeast colony grows larger and larger and then begins releasing other yeast cells or spores, which can then go and colonize other parts of the GI tract as it matures. This picture down here, picture C, is an actual picture of a biofilm of C. albicans, and this is about 60 microns in width. I'm trying to remember, I think about 100 microns is the width of a human hair. So these are not very thick films, but it is composed of many, many yeast and the surrounding biofilm that connects to it. So the key thing to understand is biofilms form quickly. That yeast biofilms can form in 24 to 48 hours, that these biofilms are a matrix of these polysaccharides that exist outside the yeast, but outside the cell of the yeast. These biofilms can significantly increase the resistance of, for example, C. albicans to antifungals. So you need 20,000 times the concentration of antifungal to kill yeast in a biofilm versus a single cell of yeast by itself. So the majority of serious candida infections involve the formation of these biofilms that protect the yeast from antifungals and from the immune system. The yeast also have another defense against another important part of the body's immune system, which are the macrophages. So macrophages are a cell which generally try to engulf, they're very large cells, they try to engulf and capture a yeast cell. But yeast cells have evolved a very nasty defense that when a yeast cell becomes engulfed by a macrophage, the yeast cell changes its shape to a hypha form. This is a very elongated form that basically forms a lance and pierces the macrophage and kills it, allowing the C. albicans cell to escape. So let me show you a picture of that. So a yeast might normally exist in a roughly round shape, but if it's engulfed by a macrophage, it forms this long lance which pierces the macrophage cell and kills it, and then the yeast can survive. So this is a second major defense that these yeast have evolved to fight our immune system. They've had millions of years to evolve, and they've become quite nasty. So there are other things that yeast can do as well. So yeast can adhere to the host tissue. So they don't just float through your gut; they can bind to your GI tract. And they can do this in two ways. They can excrete molecules, which are a lot called adhesion molecules, which literally let them adhere or glue to the intestine, but also the hypha itself, that hyphal cell shape that I showed you. It itself is, the wall itself is an adhesion molecule. Another major factor is that yeast has the ability to excrete many different enzymes, lipases for digesting fats, esterases, hemolysins, proteases for digesting protein, phospholipases, etc. So these are all enzymes that allow it to digest a very wide variety of nearby food. So the yeast excrete these enzymes out of their cell, digest the nearby food. But if they're attached to your gut, they're also digesting the gut. And so it also destroys adjacent tissues and can lyse or kill the cells that line your gut. And they also destroy the antibodies and other defense proteins that the body makes. I think we still probably have a lot to learn about the very complicated battle of our immune system against these against yeast and vice versa. So these yeast, bottom line is these yeast can locally kill cells in the gut, causing local intestinal permeability, allowing a greater proportion of toxins from the gut, including toxins from the yeast, to diffuse through that damaged part of the intestine into the rest of the body. So let's talk about yeast toxins. There's lots of them. So C. albicans alone, this one species, C. albicans, it's the most common yeast infection in humans, produces 42 different volatile organic compounds. These are mostly different types of alcohol. And they're generally as toxic or more toxic than ethanol, which is the alcohol that's served in so-called alcoholic drinks like beer and wine and whiskey. So let's think about what are the effects of toxins like alcohol. So what does alcohol cause? So alcohol can cause impairments in executive functioning. You might start making bad decisions or not be very good at decision making. It can affect emotion regulations. You might become very giddy, you might become uninhibited, or you might become very irritable and angry and get into a fight. It can affect your coordination. If you're caught drunk driving, the cops want you to walk a straight line. And when you're more intoxicated, your speech can become slurred and it can be harder to talk. So I think that these symptoms that we see in people who drink alcohol are similar to some of the core symptoms of autism. So it would be very hard to distinguish if someone has autism and then they get a yeast infection. I think in many cases it would just look like worse autism. And you wouldn't realize that it's actually a person with autism who has a yeast infection and their mind is being poisoned by alcohols and toxins produced by the yeast. So I won't say autism is caused by the yeast infections. I'll say it seems to be worsened by the yeast and by the toxins produced by yeast. So there's only been one major treatment study done to date. That was by Bill Shaw, who's started the whole autism community looking at yeast over 20 years ago. He's the founder of Great Plains Lab, and they offer some commercial tests for checking for yeast. So he did a clinical trial of nystatin. Nystatin is a commonly used antifungal. It's popular because it's very safe. It's not absorbed into the rest of the body. And what they found is they found increased level of several yeast-related metabolites in children with autism compared to their control group. And then they found that after they treated them, that these levels decreased. And they tried two different ways of treating them. They treated some children with just 10 days of nystatin, and others they treated for 70 days, 70. And the reason for the longer treatment is because yeast can produce spores, which could otherwise reseed. So the idea is so you kill the yeast initially, but then to prevent it from growing back, you give a longer treatment. So any spores that still survived, you kill those when they form new yeast. This just shows some of these different markers that we think are biomarkers for yeast. Again, we still aren't positive for all of these, but this is the initial level, and this is the level after 10 days of treatment. So it went down somewhat. This is the initial level for the second group, the group who was treated with 70 days of nystatin. We see it went down more. I forgot to mention, this is all normalized to 100% being what's normal in a normal person. So in these children with autism, and these are a subset who were suspected to have yeast infections, they had over 3 times as many of these yeast-related metabolites as did typical children. And the dosage of nystatin reduced the levels, but didn't drop them down to normal levels for some of these metabolites. So these are several other metabolites as well that also cause problems. Tartaric acid is interesting because it's also used as an additive to a number of foods, and yet I think there's a growing suspicion about concerns about it. Arabinose, you have to be careful when you measure in these urine samples because it's also found in certain fruit. So these are some very interesting results from Bill Shaw from this small treatment study they did. They reported some behavioral improvements, but it's an open label study. It's a little hard to interpret. But many physicians have also reported that yeast often returns as soon as you stop the antifungal. So they Anecdotally, many physicians have told me that they believe that an antifungal diet, a low sugar, low carb diet, is needed in most cases. It's important to realize, too, that if you think about it, human diets have really changed greatly in the last few hundred years. The average American eats over 100 pounds of sugar each year. A few hundred years ago, we didn't have processed sugar. We didn't have, and so people were consuming much, much less. And so by all of these sugary drinks and all the sugars added to so many different foods, that is probably promoting the increase of yeast in individuals with autism. So, and just the general public as well. Now, some data that has fascinated me for a number of years is data from the Autism Research Institute. They did a survey of over 28,000 families to ask them about the efficacy of a wide variety of medications. And it's surprising, of all the different drugs that have been used to treat autism, all the different psychiatric and seizure medications, the most highly rated drug for reducing autism symptoms, surprisingly, are two antifungals, diflucan and nystatin. So almost 1,000 people have reported that half their time when given nystatin, their child got better, and only 5% of the time did they get worse. With diflucan, the numbers are even slightly better. 55% got better, 41% worse. Diflucan is different from nystatin in that, unlike nystatin, it is absorbed into the rest of the body. So that's an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is if yeast has made it into the rest of their body, the diflucan will kill it off. It's systemic. The disadvantage is that diflucan gets into the rest of your body, so there's a very small chance it could cause a liver or kidney function issues. Chances seem less than 1 in 1,000 from what I've heard anecdotally, but it is very appropriate then to do a test of liver and kidney function before using diflucan and to repeat that test if you're going to use it long term. I've certainly heard of some families who have needed one of these antifungals for many months or years, that when they get off it, it just seems to come back. Also, there is some data from ARI on what we call the anti-candida diet, which basically involves low intake of sugars, low intake of simple carbohydrates, because those are foods that are optimal for yeast growth. Evaluation of 1,100 families who implemented the diet said that 58% found it was better, helped them, 39% no change, and only 3% reported it worsening. So this is very useful information, but realize these medications or this diet was generally used probably for the subset of people who had tested positive for yeast. So I'm not suggesting these numbers would apply to the general autism population. Rather, I think they apply to the subset who have been tested for yeast and found to be positive. It's also very interesting that the data is the reverse for antibiotics. According to roughly 1,800 families, 31% of the time antibiotics made you worse, and only 12% of the time did it make you better. So we think actually antibiotics are the problem, that they tend to cause yeast infections and bacterial overgrowth. And so that's really the problem in many cases. So it's very interesting to see this long difference, this big difference between the two. Okay, so then what are testing options to test for this? Now I realize I won't claim to be an expert on testing, but I'll say that we did our original study with Doctor's Data Lab, which uses culture-based methods, and there are other labs that use culture-based methods too. There are some labs that also offer DNA-based testing of stool, and I think that's also a useful thing to consider. But the reason I like the culture-based testing is at least some labs, like Doctor's Data, also do what we call a sensitivity test. So after they culture the yeast, they then will take that particular yeast that was from your stool and then test it against a variety of antifungals to see which antifungal is best for your particular strain of yeast. That's important because, especially for nystatin, that many yeast are becoming resistant to nystatin. And so it's very useful to do this type of test. But I think also it's important to, as part of this measure, some of these labs will also measure secretory IgA. So doctors' data also measured that for us. And that's a good measure of your body's ability to defend against yeast and other problems in your gut as well. Now, there are also some urine-based tests. Great Plains Lab has been the pioneer in this, offering organic acid testing, which can detect unusual metabolites in the urine that we think may be related to yeast or, depending on metabolite, possibly bacterial infections. I think we need some more research to be sure about that, but certainly many people have used those tests to guide them. There are blood tests for yeast, but it can be very, very difficult to detect in blood and often missed. In fact, for people with AIDS who were dying of yeast infections, they discovered that only about a third of the tests were positive, even though the yeast infection was killing them. So realizing how nasty yeast can be. In autism, it seems to mostly be in the gut, we think, although we really need to do blood testing to be sure. And there's that one study suggesting it is present in the blood of at least some children with autism. But clearly, because nystatin is effective, and nystatin only works in the gut, it tells us that at least in many cases, the yeast is mostly in the gut and seems to mostly probably be causing neurological symptoms. But we certainly need more research to determine which testing methods are best. We've tried to get some funding from my collaborator, Rosie Crouch-Malnick-Brown. She's very close to developing a couple new tests that we think will be very useful in quantifying how much yeast is present and detecting the types of yeast, but it's not ready yet. In terms of treatment options, nystatin, as I mentioned, is non-absorbable, so very low chance of toxicity, but the disadvantage only affects yeast in the GI tract, whereas diflucan is systemic, which is a good thing about it, but also does mean you need to check kidney and liver function. There's a lot of debate as to how much is needed. And the honest answer is we really don't know. That's why we desperately need to do research studies with advanced testing methods, because I think in many cases we are underdosing. So let me show you back again the reason I think that. In this study that Shah did with nystatin, citramalic was 350% higher in kids with autism. After treating, it was only 250% higher. I mean, it's still way elevated. And so true for some of these other metabolites, nystatin decreased the level, but didn't eliminate them. And so I think that we are perhaps underdosing. It's been suggested by Sid Baker, who's a autism physician, done a lot of, given a lot of great presentations, and has a special interest in yeast, and he has advocated giving shorter doses, but higher doses. He thinks those may be better than long-term therapies. But again, we don't know. We have no research on this. And so an anti-yeast diet may be helpful, but there's been no formal study of anti-yeast diets. So it's very frustrating because, as I say, it seems well over 25% of kids with autism have this. We've suspected it for 20 years, but no one's done the research. Why is that? Well, the problem is the pharmaceutical companies don't care because these medications, nystatin and diflucan, they're patented. I mean, they're available now. They're already FDA approved, so there's no financial incentive for them to invest in their usage. And our request to the NIH, they say, well, they're already medications, so what? Why do we care? Well, we care because we don't know what dosage to use. It seems kids with autism may well need much higher doses. They may need longer doses. They may, I think it's likely many of them need an anti-yeast diet. And without good testing and checking different doses of different types of medications, we don't know. Plus, the complication is yeast and the yeast can change. They can develop antifungal resistance. So it's very, very complicated. So the bottom line for families is test and treat, and then retest, because you may not have treated long enough, or it may well come back. So we still have a lot to learn about this, but the bottom line is if you see an improvement in autism symptoms, that's a very good clue you had some benefit, especially neurological functioning. But also, we have heard anecdotally a number of reports of a temporary die-off reaction, which makes sense. As the antifungals kill off the yeast, they'll probably release their toxins all at once, and then they'll spring back. And then she'll have a temporary burst of the symptoms they were causing, and then those symptoms should dissipate once the yeast die off. The problem, though, is if you underdose, then the yeast that comes back is going to be the yeast that's more resistant to the nystatin. So that's why I think I like Dr. Baker's thoughts of higher dose therapies, but we need research. How much higher? Okay, so just to summarize, we have 4 major studies that show, in general, many children with autism have intestinal yeast infections. Our data suggests that these are hidden yeast infections. Most children just don't know they have them. So we proposed a study where we screen many people for intestinal yeast infections and then treat those who have them. But we don't have funding for that yet. But we recommend, because it's so common and it's so treatable, that every child with autism should be tested for yeast. The exciting thing is that safe and effective treatments do exist, although we don't know exactly how much dosing to give. We also strongly suspect low sugar and carb diets, low carb diets may be needed to prevent the return of yeast infection. And we think excessive antibiotic use is a risk factor and may be a potential issue. But as I mentioned with my father, it was just so striking when he had a urinary tract infection that was a yeast infection, and how much he improved after he was treated. You could just tell very obviously. So I also want to mention briefly, we're doing a related study on customized probiotics for children with autism. This is in collaboration with a company called Sun Genomics. So rather than just picking a probiotic off the shelf at random, what they're trying to do is make it more scientific. So they do stool testing, measuring several thousand species. Based on that, they then are working on developing an algorithm to guess which are the best probiotics to best balance your microbiome. So, for example, if you have too much of one probiotic, you don't want to give that. You want to give others. You have a better balance of probiotics. And so the way the study works is anyone, not even part of our study, anyone can go be a customer of Sun Genomics. Costs about $350 for the test. Then along with the test, you get 3 months supply of a probiotic customized for each person. Each person gets a unique combination of probiotics for them. And if you want to, then you can retest after 3 months, another $350, and get another 3-month supply. Where ASU comes in is we're inviting families who are customers of Sun Genomics to also just fill out some simple questionnaires for us. There's no cost. In fact, you get a discount for participating. And you fill out some questionnaires on GI symptoms and autism symptoms before you start treatment, and then again 3 months later. And that will help us understand, first of all, what is different in the gut bacteria of children with autism. Already we have over 300 people who have signed up for this study. This is the largest microbiome study of autism that I'm aware of. So it's going to give us a lot of great information on what's abnormal, plus it will tell us what effect these probiotics have. It's a little complicated to analyze because everyone's getting their own probiotic, but I think it will give us some good clues, and I think that's a more sensible approach than trying to give everyone the same probiotic when different people have very different levels of different bacteria. So All right, I think I've covered everything I wanted to. Let me just check. I should probably put an acknowledgement in there to thank ARI for funding our original study of yeast, and also for the many families who helped us, who participated in the study. Um,
Wow, that was really great. Thank you so much for that presentation. I actually had a lot of questions that I wanted to ask, but I think you touched on almost everything. So, um, I just wanted to mention from a personal perspective myself, I actually got chills because right before we went live, I was telling Enrique that I actually had a fungal UTI recently that was mistreated with antibiotics.
oh, yeah,
And
make it worse.
yeah, and the thing that was striking is that I think that there's this, you know, in the physician community, go to for antibiotics for a lot of things. And until I was able to kind of prove with some testing and then some resolving of my symptoms that it was fungal, I had a hard time convincing my urologist that it was a fungal infection. So I really think that there's this, how can I say it, proclivity to over prescribing antibiotics, even in the broad population.
Yeah, I think that the challenge that physicians have is that it takes time for the culture test to come back on UTIs. So the physician is in a tricky point. Do they give a general uh, antibiotic hoping it will affect one of those, or do they, or do you wait a few days while the patient's suffering? So in most cases, they give an antibiotic hoping it's the right one, and then if they've guessed wrong, they'll find out in a few days. But if it was a fungal infection, which are less common, I believe, for UTIs, but if it is one, then it could exacerbate the problem. So yeah, it makes it tricky. One clue too I'll give for people is that you can also just check your urine at home. If your urine looks cloudy, so just pee into a cup and look at it. If it looks cloudy, that's certainly worrisome. And again, not definitive by any means, but if it looks cloudy, you'd want to get it tested right away.
Awesome, thank you. One of the questions that we had was, um, I guess the concern or a concern in taking an antifungal um, would be, what effect that would that potentially have on the microbiome, on the bacterial component of it? Is there an ability to, in cause some damage in an already potentially damaged situation? Are there any non-prescriptive antifungal things that might be, slowly attacking your fungal problem, but may be able to by beneficial to the microbiome or not as caustic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so with sensitivity testing done by labs like Doctors Data, they are a variety of herbal and other antifungals that can be used. I'm not aware of any data as to which one is best in general, but I think rather than guessing which one is best in general, that's why I really like sensitivity testing, because you might have a strain that's resistant to diflucan or resistant to nystatin. So that's, I think, the issue there. But I'm not worried about giving those antifungals in general, because normally it seems you have very little yeast in your gut. In fact, in one study, it's shown that in healthy people, the best way to reduce levels showing up in the stool is by brushing your teeth. And because they realized it was actually when you brushed your teeth, and that was eliminating the yeast in the oral cavity in your mouth. And that was actually the main source of the yeast in the stool. So the yeast wasn't growing in the stool, it was passing with the saliva from the mouth into the stool. So it suggests that most people don't have very much yeast in their gut. So I think wiping out the yeast, I don't know of any beneficial effect that it has. So I haven't heard of anything other than the temporary problems, the temporary die-off reaction. But I'm not a physician, I'm a researcher. So I think we still have a lot to learn, and that's why we need research studies. But I wouldn't wait for the research studies. Again, as I've tried to say very clearly, we know enough now. Yeast are nasty. and test. Everyone should test for them. The only way I think you're going to know if you have it is if you test. That the symptoms of yeast infections, we think, probably are just mimicking autism.
Very interesting. Um, you spoke about biofilm as being kind of an integral role in protecting those yeasts. Um, in the autism community, in the biomedical community, there is some protocols that actually go to looking at certain enzymes that might be able to kind of break down those biofilms. Do you think that those might be helpful in combination with an antifungal or be more successful in kind of rooting out some of those fungal issues?
There's no doubt that the biofilms are tremendously effective in protecting yeast. As I said, one well-known example from a published study, you need 20,000 times as much of the antifungal if it's in a biofilm. Um, but the question is, how do we break down those biofilms? I haven't seen any published research on that. Again, I'm not an expert in this area, so all I can say is I haven't seen any published research. So in principle, the idea of breaking down a biofilm makes sense. But in practice, our stomachs have a lot of digestive enzymes in them already, and these yeast biofilms are designed to not be bothered by those. So I'd really like to see proof that it works.
Awesome. Um, everyone knows you from the FMT research that you've been a part of, and one of the questions on my mind is that you know we see that some children are able to kind of respond um, better with probiotics and things like FMTs, and maybe others don't see quite the same improvement, or maybe some of that improvement waxes or wanes over time. Do you suspect that fungal overgrowth can prevent or inhibit the success of a treatment, something like FMT?
We don't know. With FMT, when we call it microbiota transplant, we're transplanting yeast as well as bacteria, as well as the viruses that go along with them, called bacteriophages, and viral phages too. So when we transplant, it's very complex what we're transplanting. But if we're transplanting for very healthy people, the amount of yeast we're transplanting should be quite minimal, we believe. So all I can say is that in our baseline study, we did not have the funding and ability to also check for yeast, and we found that the children with autism did very well. But not every child improved, only 16 out of 18. So there were a couple who did not. So did they have a yeast infection? Well, we're going back to try to look at that now, and give us some time, but my collaborator Rosie Crouch Malnick Brown is trying to answer that question of was yeast affected by it, and was yeast a factor in the success of FMT? So I hate to say it, but it may sound like a broken record. There's a lot we could do, but we need more funding to be able to answer that question.
And maybe can you maybe talk about the distinction between yeast, fungi, and mold a little bit? Recently, there was a publication by Dr. Sidney Baker where a child was treated with itraconazole for an aspergillus kind of infection. And I believe he had a previous paper where he even used a probiotic yeast, Saccharomyces boulardii, with some significant improvement. Can you talk about how maybe those particular drugs act, and what a yeast versus a mold, are they the same? Are they different? Are they the same family?
Yeah, so I probably should have covered that earlier. So yeast are a subset of fungi. Aspergillus is not a yeast, but it is a fungi, and it can occur in humans, and it can be nasty. So Sid Baker did a nice study with, I think it was with Bill Shaw, in which they showed that in one child, antifungal therapy specifically for Aspergillus, which is what the child had, was very helpful to them. So I should add that to my slide deck. But again, molds are separate, and molds are just a separate category, so similar to fungi and yeast, but distinct. And they generally won't colonize a gut, generally, as I understand. But they can be very present in the environment. My old house on Cape Cod is a very, very humid area and very moldy, unfortunately. So we do our best to fight that. When you're at 100% humidity, it's hard to fight mold. Generally, mold in the environment won't grow below about 60% humidity. So one of the best ways to fight mold in the home is just keep the home dry with a dehumidifier.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Adams. So we actually had the chance to have Dr. Sidney Baker and Dr. Bill Shaw with us earlier this year on this same study that you're referencing. And actually, I know that there's been a lot of interest from our community on that specific treatment, and actually some physicians have been open to trialing Sporanox in their patient population. So that has been really, really interesting. So we're actually excited about your research, and I don't know if you have any final comments for our community before we adjourn, and any final recommendations for autism families.
Well, I think, as you say, Sporanox would be great if you have an Aspergillus infection. That's why it's so important to test to see what actual infections might be present, and then to treat them appropriately. But they're very likely to return, and so checking again, but also checking for the fundamental reason why they might be low. So I mentioned the main defense against these, secretory IgA, is one important factor. So anyways, I hope it was helpful. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for your time. That's been really great, and I hope we can keep on spreading the research and the word, and get this out there to all the practitioners that this is something to look at and pay attention to, and maybe spur some more research. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Adams. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.